Welcome to Infusion Health, the podcast. And this is Rach. Today we have our guest, Gary Cass, but we're joined with Sam and Laura. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dad, you're going to be teaching us on medicine in the Civil War. Thank you for enlightening us with this topic.
I found it to be a fascinating topic. Okay, as I was saying, over 204,000 of the battle deaths in the Civil War were from battle casualties, but over 400,000, or two-thirds of the casualties that occurred in the Civil War, were from disease. And we'll get into that a little later. So 600,000 people died, over 600,000 people died in the Civil War. And these were just the military. Over 50,000 civilian deaths occurred as well, mostly in the South. A good portion of them were slaves. But it's important to realize that the reason for the enormous casualties from disease, there was many reasons. There was no understanding of the role of bacteria, viruses, and vectors play in mortality. By vectors, I mean rats and mice and fleas and ticks and that type of thing.
So what you're saying is a lot of people didn't understand that in the podcast, we did talk about some of this, that they had no concept of like what diseases that rodents and bugs were playing into this also.
They didn't, in the modern world, we know what bacteria is and we know what viruses is. Back then, they knew nothing of viruses at all. And bacteria were discovered less than 5 years before the Civil War. So there was very little understanding. Scientists might have known what bacteria were, but nobody else did.
So there wasn't hand washing techniques.
Oh, God, no. We'll get into that, too. There was no understanding of the role of proper sanitation. There are stories of the Civil War where surgeons did amputations. That was the primary surgery that was done in the Civil War. They moved from patient to patient to patient to patient and never washed their hands once.
You also said they never cleaned the beds either.
They didn't understand why it was important. They just didn't know that bacteria and viruses could live in those environments. They didn't know the role that clean food and water played in the health of the soldier. There was an absence, almost a minimum level of nursing. Nurses weren't invented yet. And this is true. The people that cared for soldiers that were injured were usually the drunks and malcontents in the unit who had no other purpose, and so they didn't want them out there with the rest of the troops. So they sent them back there to take care of the wounded. And you can imagine what a catastrophe that was.
So the people that had no idea how to shoot a gun or
were too drunk to do so.
Oh boy. And they got to take care of the sick.
Let's do that in the hospital.
And again, there was no understanding of nursing. There was no procedures to prevent the spread of infections or diseases in the medical facilities. And perhaps you know, Laura, nosocomial is an infection that's caused within the medical facility. Yeah. It was rampant in the Civil War, and nobody knew where it came from or what caused it. Medications were ineffective, worthless, and even dangerous. One of the two primary medications prescribed to Civil War soldiers were arsenic and alcohol.
Oh.
And
yeah.
Arsenic's a poison.
Yeah.
Well, the example I come up with, treating someone with arsenic is a lot like you hurt your hand, so you hit yourself in the head with a hammer.
Yeah, don't worry about your hand anymore.
Then your hand doesn't hurt anymore.
I don't either kill you or cure you.
You're not feeling it anymore.
So, Exposure to infections in the medical facilities was a major cause of mortality with the soldiers. There was a trend back then, it's called wet dressing, where they would put sopping wet dressings on the wound. Well, that's just a method of transferring bacteria.
That's a perfect bed for pets. That's a petri dish for Christ's sake.
Yes.
Inter-
Can you imagine how
interestingly,
many bed sores?
Oh,
interestingly, modern medicine uses it, but it uses it very sparingly and in a sterile manner. Not used back then either way.
well, they even had sterile water nowadays that they use with it.
And change it very often. And you said that it was left for days.
Well, yeah, they didn't know anything on how to dress a wound. The battle casualties, there was reasons for the enormous battle casualties as well. The strategy and tactics of the time and the deadliness of the weapon was not well understood. America, Europe had just come through what is known as the Napoleonic Wars. And in the wars under the auspices and against Napoleon were smoothbore rifles or smoothbore weapons that had no accuracy. And what they would do, the standard tactic of the time, was to discharge the weapons and then close in with edge weapons, swords, knives, bayonets, the whole bit. But shortly before the Civil War, they invented a thing called the rifled musket. The rifled musket, you rammed the projectile down the barrel, but the barrel had grooves in it that would turn it. The projectile they put in there was called a mini ball. The mini ball looked a lot like a thimble, and as the powder went off, it expanded and grabbed onto the grooves of the barrel, and then it took a turn, which made it much more accurate. So the tactics of the time were just not prepared for that. As I said, the rifled musket and the mini ball dictated a lot, was such a change that the Napoleonic tactics of the time, which was fire the weapons and close in with edged weapons, did not work. So after one or two volleys with a rifled musket, it was impossible for the soldiers to advance across the battlefield. Mortars, bombs, shot, shell, canister were all newly invented artillery projectiles that were much more deadly than the round balls of Napoleon's time. And of course, that was early American history too, it was round balls. But they'd come up with, we have some pictures, but the balls, they would put a canister in, and it was filled with little balls that looked like marbles. And then when it exploded all over and took out dozens and dozens of soldiers.
I believe that was called grape shot.
And grape shot was bigger. It was about it was larger, but it was the same idea, that it would have more effective that way.
Okay.
The medical team of both armies was unprepared for the huge challenges. As I was talking earlier, there was a total lack of nursing, but there was a total lack of ambulances as well. They did not understand, as modern military medicine understands. We call it the magic hour. If a soldier is injured on the battlefield and he's within definitive treatment within an hour, his chances of survival go up exponentially. In the Civil War, they left him lay there for days sometimes.
Ooh.
And what happened?
No.
And what happened is, of course, a lot of them died from injuries, the original injuries or exposure.
Bleeding, cold.
Yes.
I know. I mean, we have medics in the war now. You know, get them up, get them out. You know, we have helicopters, we have ambulances, we have all that stuff in war now.
Yeah. They didn't have it then. They didn't have it then. They didn't have nurses. They didn't have ambulances. Less than 1% of the population of the Army was devoted to medical care. Most medical assets, small as they were part of the force. There was no large hospitals under the control of the military, as there is today. There were no soldiers or vehicles dedicated to the removal of soldiers from the battlefield. There were no dedicated nurses, male or female, and no tertiary care hospitals. Tertiary means secondary care. Okay.
Now with secondary care, it's important because they didn't understand that they needed to readdress the wound after they took care of the patient, right?
Well, yeah, and as I said, one of the primary methods of treatment, the mini ball was a devastating projectile. As you probably heard, Stonewall Jackson died from a rifle shot. He was hit in his lower arm, but they had to take his whole arm off because the bullet just destroyed his whole arm.
Ooh.
And that was universal. If a shot from a mini ball was devastating. And one of the reasons, Sam, was because of the large energy. It imparted a huge amount of energy to whatever it hit. But now in terms of disease, and this may sound surprising in this day and age, but 95,000 soldiers in the Civil War died from dysentery. 37 died from smallpox. Over 10,000 died from measles, which nobody dies from measles anymore. 30,000 deaths from malaria, not a well understood disease back then either. Typhoid, 65,000 deaths, and even tuberculosis, which is almost non-existent today, caused 14,000 deaths. One of the universal truisms about Confederate medicine was it was better than Yankee medicine. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, they had less of everything. They had less soldiers, they had less equipment, they had less supplies. So they had to use it better, and they did.
Now, just for our listeners, you're saying that the South was the stronger ones that made Western medicine.
No, I'm saying they became more effective in dealing with the treatment of soldiers in the North. Neither one were really good.
Right.
Okay.
And this is because more soldiers were on the other side?
No, because they had less assets, and so they had to use them more carefully. But the number one reason the South had better medicine was because they had a better Surgeon General. The Surgeon General was named Samuel Moore. He was the only Surgeon General in the Confederate forces from beginning to end. He was an effective doctor to begin with, but he saw all these shortages and he made a dressing. On the other hand, the Union had 5 Surgeon Generals during the Civil War, and none of them were very good. The first one died 6 months into the conflict in office. He was 80-some years old because soldiers served that long back then. So Samuel Moore came up with a lot of ideas that the Union, way before the Union did. Large tertiary care hospitals. The largest hospital in the free world was in the capital of the Confederacy, not South Carolina, Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. There was hundreds of thousands of beds. They hauled them back here, and they became, they started to do some sanitation and things like that. The South put nurses to use quicker, and we'll get to nurses a little bit later. They developed an ambulance corps quicker than the Union. They began to become more use more sanitary procedures. One of the stories that comes out of the Civil War, there was a woman who was in charge of a hospital in it was in the South. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but her casualty rate was so low, and so other doctors went to see her and says, "How come you're not killing 10% of the people?" She says, "We wash them." They use clean bedding and clean dressings and things like that. And
probably wash their bodies too.
right. So there was a lot of sanitation was discovered during the Civil War. They didn't know about it going in. In fact, the only thing they knew about going into the Civil War that aided in treatment was anesthesia. Anesthesia was developed in the 1840s and 50s and was very effective. They used, they had a couple different anesthetics that they used, so they could at least knock people off when they cut their arms off and things like that. Another thing that Samuel Moore did, he developed a book. He commissioned a book. The book was named Resources of the Southern Fields and Forests. And he commissioned one Francis Portrait to write that book. And you think, well, they go out and they pick up folk medicines. It was not folk medicines. They went out, found plants that grew quinine to treat malaria. They found drugs, because after all, most drugs do come from a plant source.
Plant-based,
Yep. And so they developed them, and they sent their soldiers out to pick that particular medicate or that particular plant so that they could refine it into drugs. Prisoners were the worst suffering soldiers of the Civil War. Upwards to 20% of the soldiers died after they had been captured. Because if they were captured by the Union, at least they got decently fed, but no sanitation, no care. A lot of times they were housed they were just put behind a wall or a fence. Worse in the South, because the South couldn't even feed their own troops, let alone the prisoners of war. Andersonville was one of the worst prisons in the Civil War. It was in North Carolina. Over 15,000 people died in a period of about 6 months. They didn't plan to have, prisoners.
Because you said that they weren't planning on having this war go
Well,
as
they
long
weren't
as-
having,
They thought it was going to be over soon.
Yeah.
Right.
The guy said he could wipe all the blood up with a handkerchief.
Yeah.
So they were unprepared for that. And the reality is that a lot of these things developed during the Civil War. Sanitation, anesthetics was already developed. Amputation, such as it was an effective treatment because of the extent that the injuries from the mini ball were extensive. So your chances were about 85% if you had an amputation you would survive. But they thought it was, again, total misunderstanding. If you did not develop infection in your wound after the amputation, they thought there was something wrong with the healing process. They thought infection was part of the healing process.
Yeah.
And so what they would do is they'd go in there and jab the wound until an infection occurred, because that was normal.
Or I've also seen burning.
There was,
Cauterization.
Yeah.
there was some cauterization back then. And now nursing. First of all, when the Civil War started, there was no women in the ranks. There was no women who had anything to do with soldiers, except a few ladies of ill repute.
I have a question related to that. I've seen several Civil War reenactments, and sometimes they'll have a nun in the medical demonstration,
Okay.
helping out as a nurse.
And that was somewhat common as the war went on. First of all, nuns are attracted to people that need help, and so they did come in and offer help. But what also happened is that nursing began to develop when they found these drunk soldiers could not care for the other people effectively. There was a woman from St. Louis. Her name was Mary Bickerdite. They called her Mother Bickerdite. She was a large, large woman, and she came out and she went into the hospitals without permission and started fixing things and started taking care of people and started washing people and started making sure you got care. And the doctors got a little upset with this. And so they went to General Sherman, and they said, the doctor said to General Sherman, "We want this woman out of our hospital." And he looked at him and he said, "She outranks me." And so he knew that she was effective, you know, what she was doing for the soldiers. And very quickly, other women stepped into the profession. Clara Barton, Florence Nightingale, Mother Bickerdite. There was so many misperceptions about women. Some thought that a nurse should be someone who was pure, beautiful, you know, a vision for these soldiers to help. Others thought that a woman should be like everybody's mom, large and taking care of people. Well, what they found out is both were important. It was not their personality, it was what they did. What came out of this is that as we entered the Civil War, there was no nursing. When we left the Civil War, nursing was a profession, and it was largely dominated by women. And it was the first professional profession for women, other than women were always the caregivers, you know, and still are today.
But today, men and women are
Men,
nurses.
yes, yes. But back then, as we came out of the Civil War, you know, women had developed a profession. Many lessons came from the Civil War. The entire concept of a prosperous, industrialized economy based on slavery was found to be defective and was defeated. Not all slave states joined the Confederacy. There was 4 or 5 what they call border states stayed in the Union, and slavery was not outlawed until several years after the Civil War.
It wasn't enforced until well after that, I understand.
You've also told me that brother were fighting against brother.
Oh, that happened quite frequently. Yeah.
Father against sons.
Hidebound leadership, the people that wouldn't respond, were found unready and willing to consider the needs of the soldiers and were eliminated. The tactics of battle, again, the mass charges, new tactics had to be developed and were, but it took them many years. It took them until World War I, after World War I, to realize that these mass charges didn't work. Another thing that was found, there were no dog tags. Now, what's the purpose of a dog tag? Anybody?
Identify the body.
Identify the dead. dog tags did not become American, American, equipment until 1913. Civil War soldiers, on the other hand, realized when they prepared for these mass charges, a lot of them took a piece of paper and stapled it in the back of their shirt with their name, so that they would not go unknown soldiers.
Unidentified.
But and the Confederacy suffered more from this than the Union, but both sides had huge numbers of unidentified soldiers. I talked to a man once and went to a Confederate. The Confederates buried separate from the Yankees, and that was kind of that states' rights whole thing that we got in a fight about in the first place. But he said 85% of the soldiers in this Confederate cemetery were unknown. Causes for hope. One of the few medical practices that existed at the start of the war was anesthesia, and we talked about that. The knowledge of disease-preventing qualities of adequate sanitary practices did not exist before the Civil War and had gradually come into effect during the Civil War. The practice of getting injured soldiers off the battlefield developed during the Civil War. Ambulances were developed during the Civil War. During the Civil War, 1 in 3 soldiers succumbed to their injuries. By the time of the Gulf War in this country, less than 1 in 10 did. The practices of using nursing to stop the hospital attendants developed during the war. The use of large or tertiary care hospitals within easy reach of the battlefield had developed by the end of the war. Surgical practices changed little during the war, but some sterilization had come into effect. So this nosocomial injury or disease within the hospital lessened. Medications, and we didn't talk too much about medications, but they found a lot of these things that they were using weren't helping.
No.
And after the Civil War, not, in the last half of the 19th century, medications took a dramatic leap forward in development. So bottom line is a lot of things changed in the Civil War, but it took time for them to come into effect. So when we approach the wars of the 20th century, at least some practices resulted in less casualties.
Thanks, Big God.
So that's kind of a summary of what happened in medicine in the Civil War. And as I said, the most deadly. One statistic I read that the Civil War killed more soldiers than every war that our country ever fought up until Vietnam. The total number. 600,000 people. Any questions?
No, not this time.
Okay. Laura?
Just as a side, rehabilitation didn't get started till World War I.
Okay.
Being a retired occupational therapist, that was our history. As they
Okay.
found that the soldiers who were given something meaningful to do recovered faster and went back to the field.
Okay.
So that's when rehabilitation
I
started.
did not know that. Rachel, any questions?
No, I think you covered it very well.
Okay, well, thank you, and it's been a pleasure speaking.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
You guys, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel.